The evening air in Albuquerque carried a sharp chill, the kind that reminded Eleanor Ruiz how quickly desert nights sank into shadow. She stepped into La Terza, a restaurant layered with memories, anniversaries with her late husband Gabriel Julian's childhood birthdays, even the quiet celebrations after she had paid off another property by sheer stubborn work. Tonight was meant to be her turn, 65 years, marked not with spectacle, but with the presence of family. She spotted her son Daniel rising stiffly from the table by the window. His smile looked forced, and his hands fidgeted against the white linen. Beside him, his wife Camila gleamed in a red dress that seemed rehearsed for this moment. Her voice pitched high and sweet as she called out, "Happy birthday, Eleanor." She kissed the air near Eleanor's cheek, then guided her into a chair across from her. Extended relatives and a few neighbors murmured polite greetings, and for a while, the conversation drifted comfortably toward weatherwork and Camila's endless redecorating plans. Eleanor let herself believe it was simply dinner, a gathering without hidden blades. But after the plates were cleared, Camila folded her hands, her smile sharpening to steel. "Eleanor," she announced with a touch of theatrical pity, "Daniel and I have decided this will be your last meal of freedom before you move into the nursing home." Laughter flickered awkwardly around the table, but Daniel stayed silent, his eyes fixed on his napkin. The sting was sharp, though not unfamiliar. Eleanor lifted her wine glass, sipped slowly, and set it down with deliberate calm. "This," she said, in a voice steady enough to slice glass, "is your last meal while you still have a house to live in." Camila's smile faltered. Daniel's fork clattered against porcelain. Eleanor rose, gathered her purse, and left the restaurant with the weight of her words trailing behind her like smoke. At home, Eleanor loosened the clasp of Gabriel's old watch, the one she wore for every decisive moment, as though his hand still steadied hers. Tonight, it pressed against her wrist like an oath. She drifted into her study, pulled open the bottom drawer of her desk, and touched the thick envelope she had hidden away for years. Inside lay the deed, the proof that the house Daniel and Camila occupied had never belonged to them. She had signed it over to herself after rescuing them from foreclosure during the housing crash, shielding it from creditors. At the time, she told herself it was temporary, but gratitude never came. Now, after the spectacle at dinner, silence no longer served her. She reached for the phone and called Eduardo Santos, her attorney and Gabriel's old friend. "It's time," she told him simply. The following morning, Eduardo arrived with coffee in hand. They spread the papers across the kitchen table, the morning light revealing every seal and signature. "You hold the title," he confirmed. "If they press this, you can begin eviction proceedings. You've protected yourself better than you realize." Eleanor pressed her palm flat against the document. For the first time in years, she felt not fear, but clarity. She had been giving and forgiving for decades, burying betrayals beneath the weight of duty, but no longer. The calls began within days. A cousin in Phoenix phoned with feigned concern, suggesting perhaps Eleanor was slipping and should consider help. A niece left a message saying Daniel had told them Eleanor was struggling to keep up. Each word carried the false sweetness of Camila's handiwork. Then came the knock on the door, a woman in a white coat, clipboard in hand. "Señora Ruiz, I'm Dr. Vega. Your family requested a cognitive evaluation." Eleanor steadied her voice. "Without my consent," the doctor's reply was smooth. "Sometimes families pursue it legally." Eleanor held the door with iron resolve. "You will not enter without a court order." The woman faltered, retreated, and Eleanor glimpsed Daniel's car idling across the street. That night, Eleanor scheduled her own battery of tests, blood work, cognitive evaluations, every piece of evidence she could marshal. She would not let gossip write her story. But when she opened the jewelry box Gabriel had given her decades earlier, the velvet lining was bare. Her mother's pearls, her aunt's emerald earrings, the gold bracelet Gabriel had bought after Daniel's birth all gone. A private investigator named Mendoza, hired swiftly through Eduardo, traced the missing heirlooms within days. Pawnshop records matched the description. Surveillance photos showed Daniel and Camilla together. Daniel signing the slips as Camilla's hand rested on his arm. The pearls dangled under harsh fluorescent light, cheapened and betrayed. Eleanor felt something inside her splinter. Not grief alone, but the clarity that her son was not merely complicit. He was willing. Eduardo studied her quietly, then asked if she was ready to proceed. Eleanor closed the folder, her voice level. Prepare everything. The morning came with Camila pounding at the door, her voice echoing across the street, accusing Eleanor of theft and cruelty. Officer Rodriguez arrived minutes later, collected the deed pawn slips and bank statements Eduardo had assembled, and turned to Camila with calm authority. Ma'am, you have no legal standing here. Leave this property immediately. Camila's fury drained to shock. Daniel lingered at the edge of the yard, shoulder-slumped eyes on the gravel. Eleanor's voice softened once. Daniel. But he would not look up. Camila dragged him away, spitting a final threat. Eleanor stood in the doorway, unshaken. It's time, Eduardo repeated, and Eleanor signed the papers for eviction and theft before the sun was fully overhead. 2 days after filing the charges, Eleanor received the call she had braced herself for. Detective Silva's voice was calm but heavy as he explained that Daniel had been taken into custody at the downtown bank where he worked. The theft charges tied to the pawn slips had connected, and his cooperation with Camila had left no wiggle room. By the next afternoon, Eleanor stood in the visiting room of the county jail, the air sharp with disinfectant and buzzing with fluorescent lights. When Daniel walked in, wearing the beige uniform that erased every trace of his former self, Eleanor's breath caught. For just a moment, she glimpsed the boy who had once clung to her hand on his first day of school. But then, his eyes fell shadowed by sleeplessness, and the distance between them stretched wider than the glass that separated them. Mom, he began, voice rough and low. I didn't want it to come to this. Camila, she has a problem. Gambling, casinos, sports bets, anything she could reach. She promised every time it was the last. I thought if I covered her losses, she'd stop. That's why I took the jewelry. That's why I siphoned money. I thought I could pay it back before you ever knew. His hands twisted in his lap wrists, still marked from cuffs. I told myself it was survival. I told myself I was protecting her. Protecting us. Eleanor leaned forward, her voice steady, though her heart thundered. Daniel, you are not protecting anyone. You are enabling her. And in the process, you destroyed me. His eyes filled, tears sliding down his tired face. Please, don't press this further, he whispered. Eleanor shook her head. I can love you, Daniel, but I will still hold you accountable. Love does not erase consequences. Silence pressed in, broken only when the guard came to escort him away. Eleanor placed her hand against the glass, whispering, Find the man you lost. But I won't save you this time. As she stepped back into the Albuquerque sunlight, the weight on her chest shifted. The next steps would not be about punishment. They would be about reclaiming what she had allowed to slip away for too long. The weeks that followed carried hearings, depositions, and the kind of cold paperwork that dismantled illusions. Camilla fled, quickly vanishing with little more than spiteful whispers. Daniel remained entangled in the legal system, his fate uncertain, but Eleanor did not waver. She poured herself into rebuilding her routines. The silence of her home, once oppressive, became a companion. Mornings began with walks beneath the cottonwoods, the desert air crisp against her cheeks. Afternoons were spent at the community center with a paintbrush in hand, landscapes blooming rough and uneven, yet alive with color. Evenings brought small rituals, her balcony a glass of wine, the sunset painting the Sandia Mountains gold. It was at the community center that Eleanor joined a modest book club of women her age. Some widowed, some divorced, each carrying her own hidden history. Over tea and paperbacks, laughter bloomed soft but steady. One evening, a woman named Dolores leaned across the table and said, "It's never too late to start again." Eleanor felt the truth of it settle inside her bones. She had lived too long, as though her life's story had already been written. Now she understood it could still be edited, revised with every choice she made. At home, she hired Maria, a part-time caregiver with kind eyes and quick wit. Officially, Maria helped with errands and meals, but soon she became more like a friend. They swapped recipes, traded stories of their late husbands, and spent quiet evenings on the porch, watching the sky blaze pink. For the first time in years, Eleanor's days were not filled with anticipation of conflict. Instead, they brimmed with small joys she could finally claim as hers. Eduardo, ever the steady counselor, guided her through rewriting her will. Together, they sat at her kitchen table while spring winds rattled the windows. The decision was surprisingly easy. The properties she had built with Gabriel, the quiet investments she had protected, they would no longer be bait for greed. Instead, they would form the foundation of a scholarship for women like her, older women cornered by family and left voiceless. As for Daniel, she left only a modest sum, enough to start over should he one day choose redemption, but not enough to invite manipulation. Eduardo closed the folder with a final snap. "You've secured not just your assets," he said, "but your dignity." Eleanor exhaled deeply, feeling the weight of years lift. For the first time, her legacy no longer felt like a chain around her neck, but a gift she had chosen with her own hand. Months slipped by. The scandal that once burned hot in hushed gossip began to cool. Neighbors who had turned away in the market began to nod again, their curiosity slowly replaced with a quiet respect. Eleanor did not seek approval, but she noticed the shift. Respect carried more weight when it wasn't begged for. She filled her walls with her paintings, hung clumsy sunflowers beside bold desert skies, and found comfort in the brushstrokes that proved light always returned. Then one Tuesday afternoon, a letter arrived. The envelope bore the county jail's return address stamped in stark black ink. Eleanor carried it to the kitchen table and sat for a long while before opening it. Inside lay 5 pages in Daniel's careful, slanted script. He began with what she had waited decades to hear, an admission of guilt without excuses. He confessed to pawning the jewelry, siphoning money, and keeping silent while Camilla orchestrated her campaign against her. He wrote of her threats, how she promised to accuse him of abuse if he resisted, and how fear kept him compliant. "I became her shadow," he admitted. "Not because I loved her, but because I was too weak to stand against her." He described debts, late nights, and the lies he fed himself until he could no longer tell truth from survival. At the end, he did not ask forgiveness. Instead, he wrote, "Mom, I don't ask you to pardon me. I only ask that you remember I was once the boy who loved you." Eleanor folded the letter carefully and placed it into the drawer beside Gabriel's watch. She did not answer. Not now. The wound was too raw, but she could not throw the words away either. Somewhere between the lines, the boy she had raised flickered again. For now, that was enough. The desert summer pressed heavy, draping Albuquerque in heat. Eleanor tended her small garden at dawn, watering marigolds before the sun grew harsh. It was on one such morning, her knees pressed into the soil, that she heard a voice at the gate. Mrs. Ruiz. She looked up to see a young man, no older than 20, dark hair, catching the sunlight, eyes so achingly familiar, they froze her breath. Gabriel's eyes. He shifted nervously, holding a folder. "My name is David Ruiz. I'm Daniel's son from before Camila." I don't know if he ever told you. Eleanor wiped her hands on her apron and studied him. His posture was steady, his voice respectful, lacking the defensiveness she had grown accustomed to. He offered the folder. I only found him a few months ago. He mentioned you. I wanted to meet my grandmother. The word struck heavier than any deed or jewel. Grandmother. Eleanor gestured him inside, cautious but open. They sat at the kitchen table where so much had unraveled months before. David spoke of his mother of growing up without Daniel, of clawing his way through school with little more than determination. He asked for nothing, no money, no promises, only the chance to know where he came from. Eleanor listened, her heart stirring with something unfamiliar but welcome. Family chosen freely, not demanded. When David left that afternoon, Eleanor stood at the gate, watching him walk down the street, the desert wind tugging at his shirt. She felt a quiet strength settle inside her. The house was still hers, the will secure, the battles behind her. But here, perhaps, was something new, an inheritance she had not expected the chance to plant roots again in soil once broken. Autumn arrived in Albuquerque with cooler nights and golden light spilling across the mesas. For Eleanor, the rhythm of life had settled into something steadier than she had known in years. Days began with coffee on the porch, steam curling into the crisp air, and ended with quiet evenings of painting or reading with her book club friends. She had survived scandal, betrayal, and humiliation. Now she was learning to live, not merely endure. David began to visit regularly, careful never to overstep. Sometimes he brought groceries, sometimes just stories from his classes at the university. He studied architecture, his notebooks filled with sketches of adobe courtyards and sunlit plazas. One evening, he spread them across Eleanor's kitchen table, his excitement so genuine it made her chest ache. She saw in him not the shadows of his father, but the spark of someone determined to build rather than destroy. He never asked about Daniel unless she brought it up. When she did, he listened quietly, neither defending nor condemning, but letting the truth breathe in the space between them. That patience felt like a gift. Still, the echoes of the past lingered. Whispers followed Eleanor through town, neighbors half curious, half judgmental about Daniel's arrest and Camilla's disappearance. At church pews that once shifted away from her began to settle, though she could still feel the weight of eyes on her back. She learned to carry herself differently, not with defiance, but with a quiet steadiness that refused to bend under gossip. Respect, she had discovered, was earned less through arguments than through the calm persistence of survival. Eduardo continued to guide her affairs. Together, they set up the scholarship foundation she had envisioned, dedicated to women over 50 who faced financial manipulation or family betrayal. When the first recipient, a woman named Rosa, walked across the stage at the community college graduation, Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. The scholarship wasn't large, but it was enough to pay for certifications in property maintenance. Watching Rosa hold her diploma high, Eleanor felt a pride deeper than profit. It was proof that resilience could be passed on like an heirloom, one life at a time. Daniel remained in the background, his letters arriving every few weeks. Some were short, others sprawling, but all carried the same thread: acknowledgement without excuses. He described the routines of jail life, the books he borrowed, the prayers he whispered when shame felt heavier than the walls. Once he wrote about a class he had taken on financial literacy. "I should have learned this 20 years ago," he confessed. Eleanor read each letter, carefully folded it, and placed it beside Gabriel's watch. She never responded. Not yet. The wound still felt too deep, but she couldn't ignore the words either. They were part of her story, even if she wasn't ready to write him back into it. One late October afternoon, Eleanor drove to the edge of town to walk along the Rio Grande. The cottonwoods blazed yellow, their leaves drifting like gold coins onto the path. She carried a small sketchbook David had given her, scribbling lines that tried to capture the way sunlight shimmered on the water. As she walked, She thought of the years she had lost to silence, decades of swallowing words of bending, until her back nearly broke. She realized now that silence was not always patience. Sometimes it was surrender. And she had surrendered too much. That night, she pulled out her paints and began a new canvas. Bold strokes of orange and red swept across the surface desert sunsets, captured not as they appeared, but as they felt fierce, unyielding, alive. When she finished, she stepped back and felt a surge of satisfaction. It wasn't perfect, but it was hers. For once, creation didn't feel like escape. It felt like claiming. Winter settled in with muted skies and damp air drifting from the river. The holidays approached, stripped of their former chaos. There were no frantic performances to hide Gabriel's absences, no staged dinners to appease Daniel and Camila. Instead, Eleanor hosted a small gathering with her book club and Maria, her caregiver-turned-friend. They ate tamales and laughed until the fire burned low. When midnight came, Eleanor lifted her glass and toasted to survival, to resilience, and to the kind of peace she once believed impossible. But not all wounds healed in warmth. Letters from her parents arrived occasionally, still full of admonitions. "You are always the glue," her mother wrote. "What will people think if you abandon that role?" Eleanor folded each letter, neatly slid it into a drawer, and left it unanswered. She had lived too long by the weight of others' opinions. Their expectations were chains she had finally broken. One evening in January, Daniel's name appeared again, this time not in a letter, but in a phone call from his attorney. He was being considered for early release under probation. "He wants to see you," the attorney said. Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she hung up. She sat at her desk, staring at Gabriel's watch, the silver band cool under her fingers. Did she want to see him? The boy who once clung to her hand still lived in her memory, but the man who betrayed her lingered just as sharply. She decided she would not answer yet. Healing required timing, and she would not be rushed. Spring crept in, slowly, blossoms scattered across the sidewalks. David stopped by more often, bringing groceries or news of his classes. One afternoon, he helped Eleanor plant marigolds along the walkway. As they worked, he asked carefully, "Do you ever think you'll forgive him?" Eleanor pressed soil over the roots and answered honestly, "Forgiveness isn't a door you throw open. It's a window you decide to crack when the air inside grows too heavy. Right now, it's still closed." David nodded, not pressing further. His respect for her pace felt like another kind of healing. By April, Eleanor's paintings filled her sunroom. Neighbors stopped by to admire them, surprised at the vibrancy. "These look like freedom," one remarked. Eleanor smiled. That was exactly what they were. Each brushstroke was proof that beauty could rise even from betrayal. At the library one evening, Dolores asked her to share her story at a community workshop. "People need to hear how you survived," she urged. Eleanor hesitated, but agreed. Standing at the podium weeks later, she told the condensed truth of a son who betrayed her, of a daughter-in-law who manipulated, of the courage it took to hold her ground. The audience listened in silence, some with tears in their eyes, others nodding with recognition. When she finished, applause rose, not out of pity, but respect. Walking home that night, Eleanor felt lighter than she had in decades. Still, the past tried to reappear in expected costumes. Once, she saw Camilla's name flash on the news tied to gambling debts in another state. Another time, she glimpsed Daniel across the courthouse square, thinner, his posture bent. He didn't see her, and she didn't call out. Some doors, she realized, were not exits, but cliffs. Choosing not to step through them was also a way of living. By summer, life had shifted into a rhythm that felt almost ordinary. Eleanor tended her garden, painted her canvases, and continued to build her foundation's reach. David thrived in his studies, sometimes dragging her along to see his projects displayed in exhibitions. She would stand beside him, her heart swelling, thinking this is family too. Not demanded, not taken, but chosen. Summer in Albuquerque carried its own weight heat pressing against stucco walls. Cicadas buzzing through long evenings, and the kind of sunsets that bled across the desert like a wound refusing to close. For Eleanor, the season was no longer a backdrop to chaos. It was a rhythm she chose deliberately, filling her days with quiet rituals, and her nights with the kind of peace she once thought only other people could claim. David had finished his semester and often joined her for errands or dinners. Together, they visited the growers' market on Saturdays, where Eleanor lingered over heirloom tomatoes and hand-woven baskets. Vendors called her by name, now no longer whispering behind cupped hands about scandal. It had taken months, but the murmurs had faded into respect. She realized something Gabriel had once told her was true. People forget fast, but they remember who stands tall afterward. In the heat of July, Eleanor hosted a gathering at her home for the scholarship recipients. 3 women, each carrying their own stories of betrayal, sat around her dining table sharing tamales and laughter. One spoke of escaping a husband who had drained her accounts. Another of children who tried to seize her pension. Their voices cracked then steadied as they swapped lessons about boundaries, about dignity, about the price of silence. Eleanor looked at them and thought, this is legacy. Not just properties or money, but proof that survival can become foundation stones for others. Still, the old ghosts were never far. Daniel's attorney wrote again this time, confirming his early release. He would be on probation, required to work and report weekly, but free to walk the streets of Albuquerque once more. Eleanor felt her chest tighten as she read the letter. Freedom for him meant confrontation for her. She didn't rush a decision. She spent long evenings on her balcony, the air warm and heavy, listening to cicadas and letting her thoughts settle. The call came weeks later, not from Daniel, but from the probation officer. He wishes to see you, Mrs. Ruiz. There is no pressure, but I must ask if you'll permit a supervised visit. Eleanor sat in silence, Gabriel's watch cool against her wrist. At last, she agreed, setting strict boundaries. Public place 30 minutes, no discussions of money. The meeting happened in a quiet park, shaded by cottonwoods. Daniel looked older than his years, thinner, with eyes that carried both exhaustion and shame. He spoke haltingly at first, thanking her for not cutting him out completely, admitting the depth of his mistakes the way Camila's hold had twisted his judgment. I don't ask for forgiveness, he said quietly. I just ask that you remember I was once better than this. Eleanor listened, her hands folded in her lap. She told him she could still love the boy he once was, but that didn't erase the choices of the man he had become. Forgiveness, she explained, would take time if it ever arrived at all. They parted with no promises, only the faint relief of honesty spoken aloud. Back at home, David asked her gently how it went. Eleanor sighed, staring at the marigolds blooming by the gate. Like opening a window just a crack, she said. Enough to let air in, but not enough for someone to climb through. Autumn returned, and with it a sense of rebuilding. Eleanor and David painted the fence, the strokes rhythmic and companionable. Neighbors stopped by to comment on the brightness of the fresh white boards, and Eleanor realized how much she had reclaimed not only her property, but her place in the community. She joined Dolores and the book club women on day trips into the mountains, hiking slow trails that revealed bursts of wildflowers and the sweep of the horizon. Each time, she felt stronger, more rooted. Daniel wrote occasionally, his letters now less desperate, more reflective. He found work at a mechanic's shop, attended addiction counseling, and kept his head down. Eleanor read without reply, but she sensed a slow transformation. Whether it lasted was not hers to decide. That belonged to him. The holidays came again, simple and quiet. Eleanor decorated with strands of chili peppers and painted cards for her neighbors. Maria brought over her grandchildren, who filled the house with laughter. For once, the season wasn't stained with bitterness or duty. On Christmas Eve, Eleanor sat on the porch with David and Maria, watching fireworks bloom over the Sandias. "This is what it means to live," she whispered more to herself than to anyone else. Yet the past still knocked at the edges. Early one January morning, she received a letter, not from Daniel this time, but from Camilla. The handwriting was sharp, the tone bitter. Camilla accused Eleanor of destroying her marriage, of poisoning Daniel, against her of clinging to property and power like armor. Eleanor read it once, then burned it in the fireplace. Some words were not worth storage. Ash was a better end. Spring arrived bright and merciful, with blossoms dusting the sidewalks and a warm breeze curling through the city. At the Foundation's second award ceremony, Eleanor stood on stage and addressed the audience. Her voice no longer trembled. "Dignity," she told them, "is not granted. It is claimed, defended, and carried even when others try to take it away." The applause thundered, but more than the sound, she felt the truth settled deep in her bones. Afterward, David hugged her tightly. "You don't just survive, Abuela," he whispered. "You lead." Tears pricked Eleanor's eyes, but she smiled, holding him close. For the first time in decades, she understood that family could be chosen, legacy could be redefined, and strength could be passed on like sunlight spilling across the desert. By the time summer circled back, Albuquerque's desert heat carried a different meaning for Eleanor. Once seasons had been markers of survival, days counted in sacrifices for others. Now each shift of the sun felt like proof that she had reclaimed her time, her voice, her dignity. The cottonwoods along the Rio Grande whispered in the wind, and she felt the rhythm of her life align with them, rooted steady and unafraid. David thrived at the university, bringing home sketches of adobe structures and ideas for sustainable housing. One evening, he unfolded blueprints across her dining table and explained how he wanted to integrate traditional New Mexican design with modern efficiency. Eleanor listened, eyes shining, thinking of Gabriel, and how proud he would have been to see a grandson so determined to build instead of dismantle. "You carry the best of this family," she told David softly. His shy smile answered more than words could. Meanwhile, Daniel remained at the margins. Under probation, he kept steady work at the mechanic's shop, his letters arriving every few weeks. They were humbler now, quieter, full of details about engines rebuilt, counseling sessions attended, and the slow rhythm of rebuilding trust with himself. Eleanor still did not answer, but she no longer burned with anger when she read his words. She placed each letter in the same drawer as Gabriel's watch, telling herself that forgiveness was not a switch, but a path one she could choose to walk later or not at all. Camilla never resurfaced in person. Rumors drifted through town of debts piling up in Las Vegas, of lawsuits chasing her across state lines. Eleanor felt no triumph, only a weary kind of clarity. Some people carved their own downfall, and no amount of rescue could stop the collapse. The scholarship foundation continued to grow. With Eduardo's guidance, Eleanor secured new donors, and soon the program expanded beyond Bernalillo County. Women who had once been voiceless now sent her letters of thanks, describing how education gave them the tools to leave abusive homes, rebuild careers, or simply stand taller in the face of doubt. Each story reaffirmed that what she had endured had not been wasted. The pain had been repurposed into something lasting, something bigger than scandal. On a bright spring afternoon, Eleanor was invited to speak at the University of New Mexico. Standing at the podium, she looked out at rows of young faces, some eager, some skeptical. She told them the truth in simple words: love without respect is not love. Sacrifice without choice is not devotion. Silence is not always patience. It can be surrender. Do not surrender yourselves, not even for family. Boundaries are not walls. They are the bridges that carry respect. The room erupted in applause, but what mattered more were the students who lined up afterward, some with tears to thank her. Walking back to her car, Eleanor felt lighter, as if years of shame had finally been scrubbed from her skin. Life grew into small joys. Saturday markets with David afternoons, painting marigolds and desert sunsets, evenings on the porch with Maria laughing at old stories. The house no longer felt haunted by betrayal. It had become a sanctuary again, full of chosen company and new traditions. But one evening in early autumn, Daniel appeared at her gate. He didn't step inside, only stood on the sidewalk with his hands open, respectful of distance. "I wanted to thank you," he said quietly, "for not saving me this time. It forced me to save myself." Eleanor studied him, the lines of weariness on his face, the humility in his stance. For the first time, she saw a glimmer of the boy he once was, not buried, but struggling toward light. "That's your work, Daniel," she replied. "Not mine." He nodded, tears in his eyes, then walked away. Eleanor didn't call after him. Forgiveness would never mean forgetting. But it did mean release. The seasons turned again, and by winter, Eleanor felt more at peace than she ever had. Her walls were lined with bright canvases of desert skies and blooming wildflowers, bold strokes that shouted freedom. Her balcony overlooked the quiet streets where neighbors waved no longer with pity, but with respect. She was not the bitter widow gossip painted, nor the paranoid woman dismissed by her family. She was Eleanor Ruiz, resilient, steady, whole. On New Year's Eve, she hosted a small gathering, David, Maria, Dolores, and a few neighbors. As fireworks burst over the Sandias, Eleanor raised her glass. To survival, to boundaries, and to joy reclaimed. They clinked glasses, laughter spilling into the cold night air. Eleanor felt Gabriel's presence in the warmth of the moment, not as a ghost of loss, but as a reminder of the life they had once dreamed of building. In that instant, she knew she had honored it. Later, sitting alone on the porch, she whispered a promise to the desert sky. "Never again will I surrender my time, my voice, or my dignity." The words did not feel like defiance. They felt like truth. And to you listening now, remember this. Love is not measured by how much of yourself you erase for others. True love honors boundaries, respects dignity, and makes space for both giving and receiving. Dignity is not granted by others. It is claimed, protected, and carried like a torch no one can extinguish. If this story touched you, please share. Subscribe and comment to support more stories like this, because sometimes the most powerful legacy we leave is not wealth, but the courage to reclaim ourselves.